much for coming. Just the usual reminders before we begin: to silence your cell phones, refrain from flash photography, and then after the talk reading, please feel free to join us upstairs for a book signing. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I'm very excited to welcome our authors this evening. As Don DeLillo said in a Paris Review interview a couple of decades ago, in which I saw quoted around the internet last night, "The novel's not dead. It's not even seriously injured." I think you know that's true, otherwise you wouldn't be here this evening. Your program gives our guests CVs, awards, and achievements, but I want to share a snippet of praise for each of these first-time novelists, whom I hope will continue to write their stories as long as I'm a reader. Ron Charles, the witty and entertaining critic for the Washington Post, says about tonight's authors, "Garth Risk Hallberg City on Fire is an extraordinary performance, radiating youthful bravado that will make older authors sniff with contempt. The central miracle of City on Fire may be that it recreates this impossibly complex metropolis of New York, while also suggesting that everyone in it is more closely connected than the guests around Kevin Bacon's Thanksgiving table. And what endlessly fascinating characters they are. For a number of paragraphs, Charles goes on to extol the vibrancy of a novel whose Whitman-esque arms embrace an entire city of lovers and strivers, saints and killers. He is similarly enthusiastic about gold-famed citrus. Claire Vaye Watkins is a master of tantalizing details, the unspoken tensions and disappointments of her lovers. With her lush, impressionistic prose, Watkins describes mountains that undulate across the Southwest. Implacable dunes swallow whole cities and roll on, leaving them crushed and desiccated. But the real genius of gold-famed citrus is its speculation about the isolated colonies that might survive in this above-ground hell. Watkins is a bewitching guide through this burnt land that may lie just ahead. Amid the droughts and blackouts, past and future, sand and skyscrapers on coasts east and west, somehow these two writers haven't lost sight of that critical, empathic connection that keeps us reading. Please welcome our first presenter, Claire Vaye Watkins.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and being so brave. You're true pioneers. You're making it down to the library on this hellish night. So I'm going to read a deep cut this far into the novel. It's kind of an anomalous chapter, which has the benefit of having no spoilers, and will maybe give us something to talk about later when someone's like, what are you doing? What is that crazy thing? It's about, in part, Yucca Mountain, which maybe it might be worth reminding you is I grew up near there. It's the place where our nation will likely end up putting our nuclear waste. It's a storage facility there. And every once in a while I get asked, like, what do you think about that? And this is kind of as close as I can ever get to an answer. And so it combines my two interests of nuclear waste storage facilities and mole people. And let's see. Oh, the other thing you might need to know, or might be interested to know, is that you'll hear about the rubbings that are on the message kiosks there. I'm seeing my students. Hi, you two. The rubbings are the actual language that the scientific community has agreed that we should use to communicate about nuclear waste to future generations, hundreds of thousands of years into the future. So, it's called Wasteland, 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 this chapter. The binder does not say mole men. The mole men are a rumor, a legend. So the old, impinkened blind man with the puckered skin and long, translucent, prehensile whiskers we found in the desert near the repository is not a mole man. The binder, given to us ages ago by a gentleman representing the U.S. Department of Energy, says the nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain, just up the road from our tiny gamblers' settlement in the desert, is unmanned. The binder, which we stored until now as directed, on the wall of the county commissioner's office in a glass-faced case with a tiny hammer dangling from it, says the repository is unmanned, that the silent white bullet trains disappearing into the mountain and reappearing out the other side, empty, carry only casks, we read caskets, of spent fuel rods and pellets, and are unloaded by a gleaming robotic arm. The binder has pictures. The binder, whose protective glass face we have shattered with the tiny hammer, says the stainless steel caskets are unloaded by the robotic arm and transported by a fully automated conveyor system, or FACS, deep into the hollow earth, down the trellis of tunnels that took 100 years to dig, to their storage pods, where they will stay interred for 100,000 years. There are no people working inside Yucca Mountain, says the binder. The tunnels were dug by a state-of-the-art tunnel boring machine, or TBM. We are soothed by the authoritative, acronym-loaded binder delivered to us ages ago by the gentleman embodiment of the U.S. Department of Energy and stored in its secure glass-faced case beside the MSDS and the old, faded terror alert color wheel. Soothed, for since there are no people who dug the dark tunnels of Yucca Mountain, nor people working as stewards of the nation's nuclear waste deep inside, then it is only a rumor that there is a subterranean population at the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. Only local lore that below us, in a town perhaps identical to ours, move once human creatures whose genes the department tweaked over generations until their skin went translucent, until a scrim grew over their useless eyes, until two thick, cord-like and translucent whiskers sprouted from their faces, sensitive as a catfish's barbels, and their mouths gone a little catfish too, a side effect. The not mole man was discovered, sun-singed and unconscious, by a gang of teenagers at the Landscape of Thorns. Regarding the Landscape of Thorns, the binder quotes expert design of an architecture of peril to deter inadvertent human intrusion into the nuclear waste repository at Yucca Mountain by Magnus S. Geister of Cornell University, Manuel Brink of Sandia National Laboratories, and H.S. Travers, University of Pennsylvania. Quote, the marker is pan-cultural, pre-linguistic, post-linguistic, ominous, and repellent. It evinces the repository site as a non-place. The Landscape of Thorns was erected atop Yucca Mountain to frighten our distant and curious descendants on a primal level. It is an assembly of multilingual stone message kiosks and concrete spikes jutting from the mountain, skewering the sky. Our teenagers like to go up there to skateboard, rollerblade, bounce their tiny bicycles off its menacing concrete javelins. We've scolded them against this, but we live in a dinky desert town with one paved road. Our young people are fiends for concrete. When they were in elementary school, our young people took field trips to the monument and made rubbings from the message kiosks there. Our children once had the patience for a project like that. Now they dye their hair inky black without consulting us. They push safety pins through their eyebrows. Our refrigerators are still layered with curled etchings of star charts and the periodic table, and rubbings of warnings in Old English, Ancient Arabic, and something the placards at the message kiosks call French. That's just a joke for all you linguists out there. The rubbings say, This place is a message, and part of a system of messages. Pay attention to it. They say, this place is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. Nothing of value is here. What is here is dangerous and repulsive to us. They say, sending this message was important to us. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. Since he is not a mole man, we assume the blind man our teenagers found is a desert wanderer, and we come from a long line of desert wanderers, so we intend to treat him well. We set out finding a cool, dark place for him, a gambler's outpost in the sun-blanched, sand-scraped Mojave. We have many such places. The brothel offered him his own swamp-cooled bungalow, but when he came to, he seemed bashful somehow, with his humped posture and pinched nose, and the way he stood so politely clacking his pale, brittle claws together. Instead, we looked to the casino, a stucco cube with a gravel parking lot. We put him up in a suite, comped. We enrolled him in the Players Club with bonus play, express play, and multiplay, all comped. We granted him unlimited access to the buffet, where with a bedraggled claw he points to shrimp cocktail, steak and eggs. He tests the doneness of his eggs by probing the yolks with one slow, slick, opalescent barbel. Despite being a member of the Players Club at the platinum level, the not mole man finds no joy in playing Keno. For though we can see his eyes rolling lax behind the pale vellum of skin, he is blind as an oracle and can take no pleasure from the numbers bouncing around the television. He disdains video poker. His barbels recoil from the slots. When we gave him a bingo dauber, he tried to eat it, smeared his lipless catfish gape with a shimmer of teal lipstick. He will throw the bones at the craps table, if you ask him, but only after standing for a long time with the dice cupped solemnly in one hand, running his index claw over their tiny dimples. Though we suspected as much, the fact that he knows nothing of bingo proves the desert wanderer is no ordinary old man. And though it says nothing of mole men, the binder given to us by the freckled personification of the long arm of the U.S. Department of Energy, which we have retrieved from its shattered glass case, says there may be, quote, contaminants. If a contaminant should enter the community, says the binder, you must quarantine it. Call this number, says the binder. If you cannot quarantine the contaminant, says the binder, kill it. The danger is in a particular location, say the rubbings. It increases toward a center. The center of danger is here, of a particular size and shape, and below us. Apparently, and according to the binder, we are the first line of defense against a threat that does not exist. Quarantine can be tricky here. Ours is a town where tourists stop on their way somewhere else. Ours is a way station where visitors dock in the dark and then, in the hammering sun of morning, look around them at the burnt husks of muscle cars, at the dented trailers welded together, and say, who lives here? They move on to the national park, the Sin City. We become a story they will tell, the freaks in the desert, the mutants at the mountain, the wasteland. 3 times a day the bullet trains spear it into the earth and out again without a sound. Our teenagers ache to go with them, we know. This place is not a place of honor, say the rubbings. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. Nothing of value is here. What is here is dangerous and repulsive to us. But it is autumn. Peak season is sliding away from us, and the red broom is exploding across the alluvial fans. Yucca Mountain is magenta with them. And the mole man seems to like it here. The oracle stirs powdered creamer into his coffee with one dignified, prehensile barble. Someone wonders, what if he's poisoning us? A good one, because we've long felt hard, lentil-sized nodes beneath our eyes, unshelled walnuts growing in our throats. Our water has tannins of uranium, and we have sores that will not heal, dark motes floating in our vision, yellowing sclera, blood in our stool. Our babies are born with webbed fingers and toes, or none. This message is a warning about danger, says the negative space within our malformed children's manic charcoal scribblings. The danger is to the body, and it can kill. You are in no danger, says the binder. Also, you are the only thing standing between the rest of the country and radiation poisoning. The oracle haunts the casino floor, lightly clacking the milky keratin of his claws together. He lurks near the roulette table, listening to the dolly pop along the wheel. Peak season is over now, and the cocktail waitresses slip outside and cut spears from the aloe plants growing alongside the swimming pool. In the sports book, they sit him in a plush maroon chair and glide the slime over his burnt skin. In the buffet, the mole man gums his flaccid steak with his down-turned catfish maw. The teenagers sit with him, build creamer pyramids, jelly huts, stab gashes into the vinyl seats with butter knives. Sometimes they bring maps. Tenderly, they trace the mole man's barbels along the interstate. Blow this popsicle stand, they say. Kill it, says the binder. But there is something of us in the mole man. Bonus play, express play, and multiplay are lost on him, and truth be told, they are lost on us too. The white bullet trains come in and out thrice daily, soundless, only a slight pressing and unpressing of the air. One day the repository will be filled, and it will be sealed, and it will stay that way for 100,000 years, says the binder. One day all the toxic pellets we fear will be stuffed safely inside the mountain. The mountain will be sealed, and will remain sealed through flash floods and ceaseless corrosion and the itchy trigger finger of tectonics. The binder says this, and we believe it, even though the trains that move through town so silently you cannot hear but only feel them, those beautiful, soundless white bullets, they run on the throbbing rods they ferry. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. We have questions the binder cannot answer. Is a mole man not a man? How many times did the U.S. Department of Energy say wasteland before this became one? How many times will they chant unpopulated before we disappear? What utterance will emerge from history's longest game of telephone? Why, of all the rubbings curling on all the refrigerators, all the etchings of all the message kiosks in all the desert repositories of this nation, do none of them say, "We are sorry"? The oracle does not speak, and we are glad. We could not bear to hear what he might say. Instead, we put our ears to the dirt at dawn. We can, maybe, hear a steady rock scrape a mile below. There are someones, somethings, moving through the trellis of tunnels under us, tending the pods of stainless steel caskets. Inside the caskets, rods. Inside the rods, pellets throbbing like glowworm larvae, though we've never seen the glow and never will, promises the binder. We take our iodine tablets. At night, if we lie still, we can feel the silent white bullet trains moving through us. We have the number to call, but we have long been unable to discern the poisoned from the yet to be poisoned. Peak season is over. Winter is almost here in the desert, and there are things we want to see. The ground crunchy with frost, the dog's water bowl froze over, the Joshua trees along the highway decorated for Christmas, the red and green garlands winking in the sun, tinsel swaying in the breeze of the bullet trains. Soon, the burros will eat the tinsel, and for weeks, the good BLM boys will spot strands of it glinting in their dung. And we want to be here for that. We want to be here for the one day of snow, when our teenagers run outside in their pajamas to scrape the fine white dusting from the surfaces before it melts. Their flaxen roots grown out now, their eyebrows throbbing and infected. With their webbed fingers, they press an entire car's worth into one hard, divine, infinite snowball. Thank you.
Thank you, Philadelphia Free Library, for having us tonight. Thanks to all of you for braving the rain and coming out. And thanks to Claire for agreeing against her better judgment to appear with me this evening. We've both been on the road. I think this is both of our last weekend on tour. We both have small children. We're very excited about that. So one of the things you learn on tour is that there are other people on tour, and they've either just been where you're going or they're about to be in the place where you just left. So Claire and I have been sort of, tracking each other around the country. I think we last saw each other in Portland, and we were discussing tour rules, to which I would like to add, never eat shrimp cocktail within 500 miles of Yucca Mountain. So now I'm going to take you to another dystopian landscape, which is New York in the mid-'70s. And I don't think I need to do too terribly much to tee this up. I will say the book sort of follows 9 principal characters whose lives are gradually seen to converge in the wake of a tragedy, somewhat in the manner of Dickens, but much less effectively, probably. And you're going to meet 2 of those characters in what I'm about to read. And the principal one is named Charlie. All you need to know is he's 17 years old. He's got 2 much younger brothers. He is coming out of a David Bowie thing. And at the point at which you meet him, he's about 2 months removed from a brief, mysterious encounter with a girl on a forsaken VFW ball field in his hometown of Flower Hill, Long Island, which is a suburb about maybe 35-minute train ride outside of New York City. So without further ado, this is Charlie. Those first few weeks of grief counseling, Charlie took the LIRR in. He was always late, though. Invariably, his train would get hung up in the East River Tunnel. He couldn't tell how much time had passed unless he asked other people. His dad's watch still lay in a coffin-shaped box in his underwear drawer. And they were already looking at him funny because he was doing his nervous humming thing. Their stares only made him more nervous, which led to more humming. And when he came out of the subway, he'd bolt the last 5 blocks to the doctor's and arrive sweaty and short of breath, sucking on his inhaler.
Dr. Altschul must have said something to Mom, because after he got his driver's license in May, she insisted on his taking the station wagon, as she'd insisted on the counseling in the first place. The office was on Charles Street, in the half-basement of a brownstone you wouldn't necessarily have known was anything other than a residence. Even the discreet plaque below the buzzer, "All appointments, please ring," made no mention of specialties. This was probably for the peace of mind of clients. Patients? So no one in the waiting room would know what you were there for, who needed board-certified grief counseling, and who needed whatever it was Dr. Altschul's wife, also confusingly named Dr. Altschul, did. Honestly, that Dr. Altschul should be married at all was a mind-bender. He was the kind of bosomy overweight man who can make even a beard look sexless. Charlie kept trying to memorize the doctor's zippered cardigan so that he could determine at the next session if it was the same one. But as soon as he'd settled in, Dr. Altschul would sort of tip back in his large leather chair and place his hands contentedly on his belly and ask, "So how are we doing this week?" Charlie's own hands stayed tucked under his thighs. We were doing fine. Which could mean only one thing. Charlie was still in denial. For 8 or 10 weeks now, he'd been resisting the pressure of Dr. Altschul's questions, the Buddha-like invitation of those flattened but not knotted fingers. Charlie focused instead on the oddments of the therapist's desk and walls, diplomas, little carved wood statuettes, intricate patterns woven into the tasseled rug. He'd had the suspicion from the very first that Dr. Altschul, Bruce, he kept telling Charlie to call him, meant to vacuum out his skull, replace whatever was there with something else. It was connected with the doctor's studious skirting of the word father and its equivalents, which of course kept the person they referred to at the very front of Charlie's mind. But suppose they were right, the school guidance counselor, his mom. Suppose the dead father lodged in his skull was making him sick. And suppose Dr. Altschul could pry Dad out, like a bad tooth. What, then, would be left of Charlie? So he talked instead about school and Pee Wee League, about the Sullivans and Ziggy Stardust. When given a homework assignment, think about a moment he'd been scared, he talked about the terrifying dentist his mom used to make him go see on the 38th floor of the Hamilton Sweeney building. How old Dr. Demoto once scraped his plaque onto a saltine and made him eat it. And how the window, inches away from his chair, gave onto a sheer drop of 600 feet. Mom had this idea that for the finest care, you had to go to Manhattan. In fact, maybe ponying up for a fancy head shrinker now was contrition for Dad. Maybe she thought if he'd been rushed after the second heart attack to a hospital in the city, he'd still be alive. Heights. That's what scares me, Charlie said. And fires. And snakes. One of these wasn't even true. He'd put it in to test Dr. Altschul, or throw him off the trail. Then one Friday, a month before school ended, he found himself holding forth with unexpected vehemence about Rabbi Lidner. This had been another of his homework assignments, to recover his feelings about his adoption. Abe and Iz will do fine with the Torah study, he said. It's in their blood, but honestly, sometimes I feel sorry for them. They don't know what they're in for. There was a twitch, a resettling of fingers on the cardigan, like a cellist's on his instrument. A movement at the corner of the therapeutic mouth, too quick for the beard to camouflage. What is it you feel they're in for, Charlie? All this stuff about being shepherded, watched over, you and I both know it's bullshit, Doc. If I was any kind of brother, I take them aside and tell them. Tell them what? Shall we role play? Charlie let his gaze rest on Dr. Altschul's pantheistic tchotchkes. You know, you are alone, you were alone, you will be alone. This is a worldview you have? I've only been saying this for like 2 months now. What I feel is, basically, you're an alien dropped on a hostile planet whose inhabitants are constantly trying to tempt you into depending on them. Have you seen the man who fell to Earth? Charlie's face was hot, his asthma tightening his throat. I realize that maybe sounds like a metaphor, but you listen to David Bowie, he's thinking about what people will face in the future. I guess I'm trying to, too, because there's 2 ways of taking off a Band-Aid. Was it the cardigan he was allergic to? Its lurid flame-stitch pattern seemed to fill the room. And right then, in that moment of weakness, was when the doctor pounced. Charlie, what do you remember about your father? All of Charlie's beautiful rope-a-dope had deserted him. You make it sound like he died 30 years ago. This is what we call an evasion, Charlie. What if I just said, fuck you? Would that be an evasion? It makes you angry when I ask about your father? Is our 50 minutes up? We've got another half hour. Charlie resolved to sit silently with his arms crossed for the remainder of the session. But after a couple of minutes, Dr. Altschul offered to prorate. He seemed to feel a little bad, but probably this too was a ploy. They obviously trained them not to have feelings. As Charlie rose to open the door, the doctor told him that his homework this week was to think about it. A red-haired lady out on the waiting room couch looked up, curious. Think about what? He had an urge to grab the magazine from her hands and rip it in two. Instead, he said something a girl at school had said to him once. Take a picture, it'll last longer, and fled through the narrow basement door, grazing his head on the overhang. It was midday now, the air hotter and stiller than it had been when he went in. The lime green pelt of pollen on the cars boxing in Mom's wagon let you know they hadn't been driven in a while. Nor had the street been swept. Rotten mulberries from the trees littered the asphalt like dog shit. Charlie kept walking. As the blocks piled up between him and the grief counselor's office, his indignation ripened into something almost like pleasure. Messiness, death, righteous anger. This was Charlie's world. It pleased him that the berries were spoiling and the brownstones were falling apart and the plastic window of a convertible he passed was slashed, wires spilling from its dashboard where the radio had been. It was Dr. Altschul who was the freak, hunkered in his anal little cave, trying to sell Charlie on a world that made sense. It was Dr. Bruce Altschul who was in denial. On Bleecker Street, a speaker out front of a record store blasted Jamaican music. He saw 2 leather-jacketed boys, one black, one white, loitering inside between deep bins of LPs. Charlie's normal move would have been to hurry past, but the bright, clear flame of defiance was still lit. Woe betide anyone who tried to fuck with him now. Not that the boys even saw him come in. They were not so much loitering, actually, as pretending to loiter, while a person he hadn't noticed snapped pictures of them from across the store. Good, she said. That's great. Except, can you try not to look at the camera, dumbass? All it took was the voice. It was her, the girl from the ball field. The hair was different, or maybe it was that the headphones were gone, but her features were still larger than life. The pierced nose, the wide, expressive mouth. He flipped through some nearby records. Quick glances took in more of the boys across the shop. Or men, possibly, in a kind of uniform. Slogans in various hues covered their black jackets, superseded by an identical logo freshly painted on the back of each. The white guy's hair was short and uneven, as if cut by lawnmower. The black one wore a stocking cap. The camera would make them look lost in contemplation of the record stacks. Click, click, it went, a devouring sound, or so Charlie imagined. In reality, it was impossible to hear over the deep dish bass thumping off every surface. Then the white one, the giant one, announced he was bored. "Are we done yet?" "Are you kidding?" the girl said. "You do this like every day, Saul." "Yeah, but not in front of a camera. You didn't tell us that would make it be so boring. Plus, Nicky would kill me if he found out. No more cameras, he says." "Nicky, Nicky, Nicky," the girl said. "Why should I listen to someone who refuses to even meet only because you never put down the fucking camera? Anyway, I gotta get to work." "Fine, whatever," the girl said. "I'm out of film anyway. Go screw." But once the guys drifted out the door, she started aiming her lens around at the perfunctory record store crap, the posters on the wall, the smoldering joss sticks, the caged ferret, etc., etc. It landed, eventually, on Charlie. The eye not blocked by the camera opened and then narrowed, as if to bring a memory into focus. "Hey, wait a minute," she said. "I know you. How do I know you?" When he tried to speak, the heavy patchouli odor became a tickle at the back of his throat, leading to a coughing fit, and then wheezing, and ultimately to the inhaler. "The VFW field," he managed finally, little tears in the corners of his eyes. "You had headphones on," and did the universal sign language for headphones. "Oh shit, that's right," she said. "What are you doing here, though?" He looked over at where the matching jackets had been. "What's anybody doing here?" he said. "Getting the hell off Long Island." Back there in the dugout, the girl had been a school kid, like Charlie. Now she was the emissary of some more adult world. "Listen," she said, "I've been up since yesterday morning, and I've got to get some caffeine. Do you want to come with?" He wondered if she wasn't hustling him out of the store to spare herself the embarrassment of being seen with him should her friends return. But outside, she stuck out her hand. "I'm Sam, by the way. I didn't mean to give you the third degree back there." "Jesus, no," he said. "It's just weird running into you again like this. Shouldn't you be in school?" "Shouldn't you?" "I had a doctor's appointment. Otherwise, my mom wouldn't have let me drive in." "Right, the bloodhound. I remember." She lit a cigarette. He willed himself not to cough. "My dad can be pretty bad too," she said, "but he thinks I had a volleyball tournament last night. All he'd have to do to verify I've never touched a volleyball in my life would be to pick up the phone, but then he'd have to have me around and, talk to me instead of hiding out in his workshop. And anyway, who would want to miss all this?" It was true. Greenwich Village, on a Friday at lunchtime, was the opposite of everything Charlie hated about the suburbs. People everywhere, street musicians, smells of 15 different foods floating out of the propped open doors. In a smoky luncheonette, she led him to a booth by the window and ordered 2 coffees. The waitress stared at her until Sam said, "What? You couldn't order egg salad or something? This is becoming an everyday thing, Sam." "I'll make it worth your while," she said. "Promise." The coffee came in paper cups, as if inviting them to vamoose, but she picked hers up and blew on it and took a drink, black. Then she said, "So what's wrong with you?" "Huh?" he said. "Your doctor's appointment." "It's, not that kind of doctor?" "Well, obviously," she said, "in this neck of the woods, and if you're driving by yourself, it's a shrink, right? I meant, are your folks splitting up, or what's the story?" "My dad," Charlie coughed again. When he'd finished, his voice came out quieter than he meant it to. "My dad died in February. Right before I saw you, I guess." "Fuck, you should have said something. Are you okay?" she said, and put a hand on his hand. His heart almost stopped. "I don't want to talk about it." "I respect that," she said. Most guys, they just use something like that to get in your pants. Outside, pigeons scrabbled over scraps at the curb. He pretended to like coffee, and after a while, did. You must come here a lot, he said, to know the waitresses. She explained. After my mom split on us, my dad decided to spring for a fancy school. He admired the casual way she repaid his confidence with a confidence. It's right around the corner, and I started at NYU in the fall. I should only be a senior, but I skipped a grade. And your friends, he said, the guys at the record store? She smiled. Saul, the tall one, I know through his girlfriend, who I know from shows. I've been putting together this little, magazine thing, trying to document the scene. But it took me 3 months before his friends would let me take photographs. One of them still won't. They can be funny about who they let in. I meant, he said, do they go to school with you? School's not punk, she said. Punk? I can see I'm going to have to educate you. He used a spoon to dredge up the coffee-brown sugar crystals from the bottom of his cup and licked them like a bee harvesting nectar. I'm highly educable. For some reason, it made her laugh. Anyone ever told you you're a charmer, Charlie? He shrugged. No one ever had. Seriously, she said, Saul and those other guys, the post-humanists, their idea of changing the world is just to say no to everything. I don't think you can really change anything unless you're willing to say yes. No, I've already decided. Us Flower Hill kids have to stick together. You're going to be my project. Charlie felt that perhaps there was something not right about this, implying, as it did, a need for improvement. On the other hand, it was a nice day. He was no longer in the therapist's office, and he had the attention of a beautiful girl. Out on the street again, they dumped their empty coffee cups into an overfull trash can. Charlie wasn't deft enough to avoid bringing a whole mortifying mound of soda bottles and newspapers and styrofoam takeout containers crashing down around his hush puppies, but Sam just laughed again, and it wasn't the kind of laughter that subtracted anything. It was a warm breeze lifting him up. Then Sam was planting her fingers around Charlie's shoulder blades and propelling him back through the door of the record store. The register was on a raised platform near the back. The bear-like clerk, too, seemed to know Sam, for he nodded at her from on high. Charlie drifted over to the B's and began to flip through ba, be, bi, bo. The Bowie selection was impressive, at least compared to the cruddy little strip mall storefront he was used to. There was a colored vinyl single of Suffragette City and an expensive live recording with a sticker that said import. He wanted to look at it more closely, but as soon as he saw Sam coming, he put the record back in its place and reached for another tab at random. George Benson, she said? Yikes. What? No, I was just goofing around. Well, here's your first mission, should you choose to accept it. She handed him a 45. There was a turntable near the register where you could listen to records pre-purchase. Sam placed the headphones on Charlie's head, a weirdly intimate gesture, and queued up the B-side and watched his face while he listened. At first, he thought there was something wrong with the headphones. The music was a distant tempest of revved-up drums and guitars. But when the instruments locked up and the chanting started, he understood it was a style. Amateur, noisy, aggressive. It was anger heated to the boiling point where it became a sort of joy. The very feeling Charlie had felt this morning, storming out of the doctor's office. When he looked up, Sam's mouth was moving. He took off the headphones. What? Amazing, right? It is amazing, but I don't have any money. I'll buy it for you, she said. I can't let you do that. Sure you can. Anyway, I owe you. For what? He said. You said you have a car, right? You're driving me home. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Garth, for those readings. The way this works is you raise your hand, I'll call on you, and we'll get a microphone to you. Is there someone who would like to start us off? No? Okay, in that case, I'll start us off. Oh, gentleman right here in the second row. Yeah, and then we'll go to the fellow with the hat.
Hi. Thank you guys for reading. I have a question for Claire. So I think you sort of alluded to the question that I was going to ask with your reading. I was really interested in the way that you started to articulate point of view in this novel. I noticed that we stick with a couple different characters, but then there are movements into a wide variety of points of view, and I wondered if you could just speak to the choices to do that and sort of how you thought about that while you were conceptualizing the novel.
Yeah, basically like the first 100 or so pages is just really conventional, like third-person limited from the point of view of this young lady, Luz. And then, I wish I had a highbrow artistic rationale, but I just got kind of bored working in that way. So then I've always kind of had this just like a bit of like a aesthetic wanderlust kind of thing. So I wrote some passages sort of omniscient, almost like from space, looking down on the sand dune sea. And then, I think this had to do with like my idea of what a novel could do. I wrote this book of stories, and it was very much about like discipline and tightness and being taut and exacting. And then it occurred to me that a novel could be a lot messier and a more accommodating of a lot of different styles. And so I just would give myself these exercises like, I don't know, try to write a story about that's, vast into the future, like this thing that I read tonight. And I would always say like, I'll just throw this away just to get me typing. But for better or worse, I almost never threw them away. And I just decided like, this is a book that has that weird thing in it and this weird catalog of animals. And that was actually when I enjoyed the writing, when I thought like, a novel, you're allowed to like, right?
You're allowed to enjoy the writing.
Yeah, you're allowed to enjoy writing. A story, what does Joy Williams say? A short story does not want to be your friend. And that's true when you're writing one, too, Did you find this like a forgiveness in the form?
I actually think that, I've been asked a lot about sort of like the long novel.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a certain like genre of novel that's like 180 to 220 pages that will allow perfection.
Yeah.
I was just writing about Dennis Johnson's Train Dreams today, and it's like, it's perfect. I mean, there's like maybe 3 words I would change if I was Dennis Johnson, and maybe not even then. But if you have that kind of discipline that you were talking about at 400 pages, or God knows at 900 pages, it starts to, for me as a reader, it starts to feel like monolithic and kind of exhausting. And so to generate rhythm, I think at lengths longer than 200 pages, you have to sort of start to make some departures and to have some, interesting compressions or cuts in time, and to start to, stretch a little bit and sag a little bit. And because ultimately by the end of the book, like that's what gives you the sense of rhythm. And that's, when you get to the end and you want to start generating a sense of momentum, you need to be able to compress. If you're already compressed all the way down.
Yeah, you can't be at 11 the whole time.
Yeah, I'll go up to 11.
Right.
No, that's the dream. The next book. It's
all
going to be
11.
180 pages
180
at
pages
11.
all at 11.
Yeah.
We'll both try it, and we'll meet you here in
Sounds
1
good.
year. Right?
A novel up.
Yeah, right. I'll meet you here in 10 years, probably.
Garth, can you talk a little bit about how you played with point of view in your book?
Well, I was going to ask Claire, actually, because she's talking about it from the writer's point of view, and of course there's that. You never want to admit that you get bored. Hopefully you get all the bored marks off the book by the end.
Yeah.
But there is this sort of, like, wanderlust that sets in. But from the reader's perspective, that makes an effect. Like from your perspective, it's like, I'm having the kind of fun that will bring me back to the desk for 3 years or 5 years, but from the reader's perspective, that registers as an effect. So one of the things that, I was actually thinking a lot about is that point of view is a moral gesture. Affording point of view to a character or allowing a character's consciousness to inflect the narrative. And I was trying to sort of act a little bit of that out with the reading. Like, sometimes the third person, I'm acting it as Charlie, and sometimes it gets very neutral. But granting point of view to a character is sort of a way of saying to the character, like, how you see things matters.
Yeah.
In a world where we're, like, almost, I don't know whether it's biology or, how we're acculturated or whatever, but it's so tempting to just see other people as instruments. Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that was really clear from your reading to me is that, this jump actually allows you to enter a kind of, not moralizing, but a moral space about, like, what's going on elsewhere in the novel.
I like that idea a lot. Like, it is a moral or a political act to give someone a voice. And it's also, for me, always a real, I have to take it seriously. On one level, just to get the language right. Like, I think that everybody deserves their own, like, lexicon, right? And their own bank of figurative language and all of that stuff. And I almost get intimidated by thinking about going into someone else's point of view if I know that I don't have their language right, But, and then in your piece, the narrator had those moments where he or she himself had a voice too. Did you think of that language register differently?
I did. And I actually think there's what I learned. I came out the other side of that, and I realized that sometimes, like, over fidelity to the language feels like to the language of the character, what we think the language of the character is, it becomes almost patronizing in a way. So, famously, Updike has this thing where, like, if the character is I was going to say if the character's an obstetrician, but that sentence is going to end off color. If the character is a place kicker in football and he's walking down the mall in Washington and sees the Washington Monument, it looks to him like a football kicker's tee. If the character is a conductor, he thinks he's a giant conductor's baton. And it's very, like, over-determined almost.
Yeah.
So there's this interesting, like, line that you've got to walk between, like, respecting the character's voice and also allowing them to be surprising.
Yeah, totally.
Question from the audience.
Oh, look, there's one in the front.
Gentleman in the front here. Right in
I'm
front.
micromanaging your
One of you could get
Karad
right to the guy in the front
management,
row. Thank you.
I'm like getting like a teacher. I'm like, oh no, someone might not
Sorry.
be able to contribute.
Sir, you can sit back where you were sitting. It's perfect. We'll hear you from there.
I feel like everyone's staring at the back of my head. So I'm going to speak loosely to avoid spoilers. You both give sympathetic characters some very, like, hard ends. Was that built into their creation? They were doomed from the beginning. At some point, in the process, did you think, oh, this character who I'm attached to has to go for the sake of the story? And how tempted were you to grant reprieves?
Yeah. In my case, when I was about 70% of the way in, or 74 maybe, it occurred. I just kind of saw how it would end, and knowing that, and then I wrote towards that. And by the time I got to it, I was like, I thought, well, it probably won't hold up when I get to it, but then it did. And by that point, I was pretty. I just had a feeling that there was a right thing to do, because it seemed to insist on itself. One of my teachers used to tell us to never rescue your characters from the ending that they deserve. But I had good suggestions to think about others, but it seemed, I guess it was a lot of, like, instinct and kind of going by Braille. It just seemed like the right thing to do at that point.
The dream is sort of to have the whole novel insist on itself. Like, anything that doesn't feel like it's insisting on itself goes. I think it's shocking always to learn that people have masses of material that ends up on the cutting room floor. Like, you don't think about it, but it would be a betrayal of that, I think, There's a great like exchange between Forster and Nabokov, and Forster's talking about like the characters take over.
Yeah.
And I do think there's that thing that writers do to avoid like looking too closely at the machine and figuring out. You don't want to know like how your brain works.
I want to know how your brain works, but I don't want to know how my brain works. You know, like I
And
don't want to do
vice
it.
versa.
I don't want to do it with my own work.
But so Forster's way of doing this, I think, is to be like, I don't know, the characters just take over. And Nabokov says, and part of this is his shtick, right? But he's like, my characters are galley slaves. I whip them and they go where I want them to go.
Yeah.
And I have discovered, I've started saying this and I'm not sure if it's true or if I want to know that it's true. I'm going to try to forget it before I get too far into the next thing. But like work comes to me like in this kind of very fused form, and once I pry it apart, I often find that I've got something from Act 1 and then I have like the start of Act 3. And like I know nothing about what happens in Act 2, and I know nothing about what happens after the start of Act 3, but that a lot of the early writing is trying to get from this place where it starts to the place where Act 3 starts. But then it's kind of like, if you knew anything beyond that, you'd be like depicting this very deterministic world, which would be right if you were had a certain kind of worldview. But if you're like, every character deserves the open destiny of life, then I think you've got to kind of go in there like listening to what the book is insisting on and the characters are insisting on.
That's true, right? And I think readers can sniff it out if you try to make like a hard right turn toward optimism that isn't, like The Road. You read The Road?
No spoilers.
Oh.
I haven't read it yet.
Well, come on, Garth. It's been like 10 years. All right. Well, you know what I'm talking about with The Road. Yeah.
Or like the happy ending of Blood Meridian. The musical number that ends Blood Meridian.
The wedding.
It felt
the
very
wedding
forced, very tacked on.
Yeah, exactly. He's famous for his hard right turns
His
into
uplifting.
optimism. Yeah.
Do you ever come downstairs, or I imagine all writers working upstairs?
Yeah, I
for some
work
reason,
upstairs,
even.
yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay. Do you ever come downstairs and you're like, eating a meal with your husband and you just like are really sad because of something that you discovered happened in the book?
No.
Okay.
Do you do that?
Oh, I get massively depressed.
Because something sad happened in your book?
Yeah, that I didn't see coming, and I'm like, oh, shit.
And you're sad for the people?
Yeah.
But they're just ink and papyrus.
Not to me, they're not. You're Nabokov.
I'm the
over here.
Nabokov
They're just
to your
your galley
Forster.
slaves, so don't worry about their feelings. I'm trying to grant them a point of view,
No, I'm the one true God in the world.
All the way in back on the left, and then this fellow right here in the center.
When you teach, do you try to go male, female when you take responses? I've been very conscious of that on the road.
No, some of my students are here. They could answer that better. Most of my students are women anyway, so.
I don't have a question for Garth. I just have a comment. But we're talking about perspective and point of view. In 1977, I was a 17-year-old kid from Long Island hanging out in the record stores in Greenwich Village. So in a way, this is a little bit weird listening to you talk about this. The perspective is pretty spot on.
Thank you.
Really. I actually felt like that was me walking through the store, checking out Bowie, the imports, stuff. You got it right.
Cool. Thank you.
That's like every writer's
yeah,
worst nightmare, by the way.
No, it's
I'm
not.
not
Because
creeping.
when I was writing this thing, like, I was, the very first people who read it, it was like at a state of pretty much completion, and then I had to hand it to people who were around then, and I was just like, but the record store in the book is called Senor Wax, but in real life, it's like, it's got a heavy Bleecker Bob's influence, the late lamented Bleecker Bob's.
Gentleman in the black sweatshirt.
This is for either author. I guess I know you guys have mentioned a couple names. I know Mr. Hallberg said Dickens, but what authors have most influenced your work?
Dickens was big for me too. But what about Dickens for you? I wanted to ask that.
What about Dickens?
Yeah, like why?
He's just so generous. There's just something like, I just have this tendency to read the form of the novel as a, like, you know, way that you might be in the world. And he's just so generous. Like, even when he's exasperating, he just overflows. You know, there's just, on every page, there's something that he's giving you. And the villains are always these people, like, you know, he's great on water. Like, he loves to write about water, rivers, fogs, things that flow. And he, like, hates, like, containment, stoppages, misers, you know, grasping, holding. He wants to, like, release, you know, everything into the flow and, like, let it flow through him. And that's just like I mean, it's not a way that I can actually be in the world, but it would be a beautiful way. And it wasn't a way that he could be in the world either. He was like a terrible father and, you know, all these things. But that bad husband, you know, kind of a jerk, you know, but on the page, I mean, and fun. And he's really fun.
Yeah, yeah. He can be somebody that you could, I spent a lot of, like, he was probably the first novelist that I read in high school that I actually liked, and I was like, yeah. And then I tried to write like that, which is a dumb thing for, like, a 16-year-old kid in the desert to do. Like, you can just imagine the stuff. Who else? Joan Didion and Louis Erdrich and Fitzgerald. Like, Tender is the Night is kind of like my version of the perfect novel, because it's like messy, but every single sentence you just, like, roll around in it, and I love that book. What else for you?
Oh boy, I'm a big Faulkner nut.
Oh yeah.
I love Bellow. I love Deborah Eisenberg.
Yeah.
I love Norman Rush. DeLillo was big for me.
Pynchon?
I'm an avid reader of Pynchon. I would not, like, he's just doing his own thing. I don't know. Whitman, you know, poets. Like, I tend to think of novelists as, like, failed poets. You know?
Yeah.
Like, in a good way. You know, like, but.
Yeah. It's like somebody's like, you might as well just go all the way to the right margin. There's nothing for you in this, you know? Yeah.
Maybe we can end on something that jumped out at me about both books, and it just seems to be staring me in the face, at least, just this gargantuan sense of place for each of you in these books. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit. Perhaps more specifically, how place affected your creation of the characters.
Yeah. Well, I don't really know any other way to make characters or figure out who somebody is until I figure out where they are and
Thank
what
you.
they...
Bless you for saying that.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
I was just on a panel with someone, and it, like, great guy, great writer. What he was saying totally made sense for him, but he was like, yeah, you know, like, I don't really, like, a character could be from one place or another. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. And he was like, listen, I was born in Australia. I woke up in Paris yesterday. I read The Guardian, which is published in Manchester. I ate some Thai food. And I was like, that's just your life, man. Like, you're, like, living like Davos, man, you know, just floating over the Atlantic. Like, but for me, it's like...
Placelessness can be a place, too, you know? Yeah. Like, there's a really great story by my old teacher named Christopher Koch, and he wrote the story... that's set, like, on the road, and it's just about placelessness and the darkness and the lines moving behind you. But that makes that makes those people who they are, that they're there, or that they. I mean, even in, like, minimalistic modes, like somebody like George Saunders, you know, in some of Saunders, I bet Saunders knows where all those people are coming from, you know.
I think probably so. Like, my wife said, she said something to me recently. She was like, oh, you know, the thing that people don't sort of understand is that you're actually, like, a Southern writer. I'm from the South, and, like, the sense of place is this big Eudora Welty kind of thing, and it's impossible for me to, like, conceive of a human being who's not deeply inflected. But, like, there's a character in the book. There's two characters, and like, one day I was, like, writing a sentence that involved where they had come from, and it was Buffalo, and I was like, oh, oh, Buffalo, that explains everything. That explains
Yeah.
everything. Like, I don't need to put a whole bunch of stuff on the page. It's not, like, if they were from Philly, they wouldn't necessarily be like eating cheesesteaks like visibly, but it's
Right.
just like everything is bound up with place.
Yeah, and I like where I come from, in the American West, it's more about like where are you from, like who are not really like who are your people, and not really where'd you go to school, which I get in this part of the country a little bit more, but that's like how we figure out like where, and we don't mean it like figuratively, like where are your people, because most of our people are not from Las Vegas or whatever, but it's like, yeah, I get that, like Sacramento, yeah, like I get it. It's like a way of making sense of the world. Place,
Philly. I think we'll just end it there. Please join me in thanking Claire Vaye Watkins
Thank
and
you.
Garth Risk Hallberg.